Hello, I'm John Carlin, the chair of the Aspen Digital Cybersecurity Program, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 5th annual Aspen Cyber Summit. Normally, for this summit, we'd gather in person in a place like Boston, New York, or San Francisco to spend a day talking together with some of the most informed people inside and outside government about the online threats our nation and our world face. This year, unfortunately, I'm joining you from my living room instead, an appropriate setting, given the world's rapid transition this spring to socially distanced working from home environment amid the pandemic. A global health crisis that has had profound implications for technology and the internet, from cloud computing to ransomware to the US presidential election, as we'll hear and discuss over the coming days. Over the next 3 days during the summit, we'll talk about the most pressing challenges facing the modern digital world, hearing from more than 40 speakers across federal and state government, the private sector, academia, and civil society. I want to thank FireEye, Intel, and Proofpoint for making this week's summit possible and helping us convene such an important set of conversations and to help us understand such a complicated year. We would also like to acknowledge Blue Vector, CISA, and the American Gas Association for their additional support. It seems like in a particularly important year, maybe unprecedented, to have conversations like these. And while we've worked on these digital security issues together for years now, I don't think the world has ever had an instance where they've been more dependent for work, for play, for holidays, for safety on digital technology. And we're grateful to FireEye, Intel, Proofpoint, Blue Vector, CISA, and the American Gas Association for how understanding how important these convenings can be. The full summit agenda and bios of all our speakers are available at aspencybersummit.org. We have a great day ahead of us today, including conversations with Cloudflare's Michelle Zatlyn and former Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Sue Gordon, alongside Alex Stamos, the former Chief Security Officer for Facebook and the founder of the Stanford Internet Observatory. Over the next 2 days, you'll also hear from the Director of the Secret Service, the Chief Information Security Officers from 2 companies on the front lines of developing a COVID-19 vaccine, and certainly our hopes and prayers are with them, as well as my successor as the Justice Department's head of national security. Informed by events like these and the conversations that take place, we'll also be announcing this week for the first time the Aspen Cybersecurity's National Cybersecurity Agenda, designed to help set the stage for action by the incoming Biden administration and the new 117th Congress. Again, join us all week at aspencybersummit.org. For today and throughout the summit, we'll have the Zoom Q&A function enabled to hopefully allow for the type of dialogue that we encourage when we meet in person. So please feel free to submit questions, comments. And now I'm pleased to introduce Kara Swisher, the host of the Sway podcast at the New York Times, in conversation with Matt Travis, the recently former Deputy Director of CISA, DHS's main cybersecurity agency. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. How are you all doing? Thank you so much for having me here. And I'm very excited to interview Matt Travis, someone I've wanted to talk to a lot about cybersecurity and other issues. And we've got a lot to talk about. Welcome, Matt. Thank you for appearing here.
Thanks, Kara. Good to be with you. And thanks to Aspen for the invitation.
I like your Spinal Tap thing behind you in your hallway.
I've been relegated to the basement since my kids are in home learning, and this was the lightest corner I could find. So
okay, this is fantastic. All right. Okay. It gets a 9 on Room Rater. Anyway, let's start beginning to talk about recent times. I want to talk about where it's going and everything else, and the walk up to the election. But first, I think everyone is most interested. Obviously, you resigned after Chris Krebs was fired at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So why don't you walk us through 2 weeks between the election and Krebs's firing, and what was it like to be inside CISA and what you were all talking about in that as that time period unfolded?
Sure. I'll go back 4 weeks. So the election was 4 weeks ago today. And
Right.
because of the pandemic, we knew that the results process would be protracted because of the mail-in voting. And so we were kind of gaming out some of the contingencies that we'd want to be prepared for. And the first several days after the election were quiet because it was still, states hadn't really called for either candidate, number of key states. And we got through the weekend when most major, I think AP first called it for President-elect Biden. And it wasn't really until that next Tuesday, it was the day before Veterans Day, when Politico dropped a piece Tuesday night about essentially, here's the government agency you've never heard of that's countering the president's lawyers' claims about impropriety or fraud in the election. And I remember that night texting Chris when I saw it first. And I said, if this doesn't get you fired, nothing will. And his response back was essentially, yeah, this might do it. Now, the next day, Reuters wrote a story saying he had told people that he expected to be fired. My texting wasn't the source of that.
Right. But this was an agency that people were aware of that had been monitoring these issues.
But Kara, I got to tell you, we were 2 years old agency. So I think still technically the youngest federal agency on the civilian executive branch. And most people who don't work with us probably had not heard of CISA. I think we were getting a little bit more attention as the election day drew on, and certainly Chris and Acting Secretary Wolf were making appearances kind of promoting the best practices for what to expect on the election. But we generally had tried to fly under the radar, knowing how fraught with peril this election might be because of the non-traditional way that the votes would eventually be tabulated and the timing really of that.
Right. Well, let me ask, were you more worried about the non-traditional way because of the COVID issue, or were you worried about Trump's continued politicization of this issue? Because leading up to the election, he had been doing that actively on Twitter and other places.
Certainly. And we tried to kind of filter out that noise. We were mostly concerned with knowing that because of the heavy mail-in balloting, that you would not have an election night result. And we would say as much. It's going to take several days, if not a week, before we know the winner, and try to inform the electorate about the process and what to expect, and not to get overly anxious about that. But obviously, as the days wore on and kind of the rhetoric coming from the president's campaign continued to kind of contradict what we saw and what we knew to be the case, we recognized that the tension could continue to probably grow. And so when Politico kind of called it out in the open, that was really the first straw. And then there were a number of articles in the days forth. Now, the next day on Veterans Day is when White House personnel called our chief of staff to inform her that the White House was going to ask for Brian Ware's resignation. Brian was our assistant director for cybersecurity.
Who had made public comments, about that.
I don't know if it was that. I mean, we all went through I don't know what it was, frankly, Kara. We all went through the re-vetting, if you will, over the smmmer with White House personnel. And I think not knowing, that's Brian's story to tell, but we certainly pressed that it'd be silly to change the CISA team, not only when we're running point on election security, but also on Operation Warp Speed, which Brian was the lead on, working with the healthcare sector and vaccine suppliers. So our chief of staff asked, is that the only one? And this is Wednesday, so this is Veterans Day. And my understanding was the answer was that's it. And so we thought, okay, well, let's keep going.
And he resigned, by the way.
He resigned effective that Friday. Big loss. Both he and Jeanette Manfra were just tremendous leaders of what is the new cybersecurity division within CISA. And so I think David Sanger ran a profile on Chris on Friday, and Garrett had written an article, and then on Washington Post editorial board on Sunday. And so we knew that with each article that we're calling attention to CISA's and specifically our rumor control website, that it may be continued difficulty in navigating a narrow path to.
But the whole point of your rumor control and all your efforts were to publicize the safety of the election and your assessment. So hiding under a rock really isn't an option for your group, correct?
No, we weren't. Yeah, we're not trying to hide under a rock. And frankly, Chris got the idea on the rumor control from FEMA. They use that in terms of trying to bat down rumors during hurricane season and getting ground truth out. So we thought, hey, that's a good idea that we implemented. But we frankly expected that to be used against foreign adversaries, what we saw from Russia in 2016, that disinformation campaign of using fake personas online and putting out falsehoods to swat those down, but also to educate the voters about the electoral process. We've been working closely with the entire election community for 3 years, and we wanted to show transparency in terms of, if this happens, this is what it means, and if this happens, don't be alarmed. And that was really the purpose of that rumor control.
Just to give accurate information out.
Yeah,
but when the president was tweeting out before and saying things publicly, it was a lot on Twitter, but he did it a lot of places in his rallies. Did that worry you, that they were doing things counter for what was on your website?
We took the stance that we didn't need, it wasn't our role to fact check the candidates. That we were going to stay out of that political process, and the candidates and the media can hold them to account, or others. But once the election had been conducted, and the electoral process of canvassing and of counting and of certifying was in place, then we felt it was our role to be articulating the ground truth on what these processes entailed and what security protections had been built into these systems. And so to answer your question, though, Carrie, yeah, it wasn't helpful, but we kind of expected that, probably not to the extent and the volume of it, and how long it continued. So just to continue the week, then it was on Tuesday. Monday was very quiet, so this is 2 weeks ago. Tuesday was also pretty quiet. It was business as usual at CISA. We had a lot going on. People probably maybe not realize it's not just the cyber domain. We've got responsibility for the physical protection of infrastructure, all 16 sectors. And we also have an emergency communications role. So we have a lot going on. It was business as usual. And then on Tuesday night, about 6 o'clock, I think it was the Washington Examiner put out a story that cited some White House sources. And they made a kind of a crass joke about Chris's hair. So we were giving him grief over that. And that was probably about 6 p.m. 7:15 is when Chris called me. I was playing with my son, and he said, "That's it. He's done it. I'm fired. You got it." And I said, "Wait a minute. How? What?" And he said, "He fired me on Twitter." And that
he was not called. He was not called.
He was not called. He learned it, and Chris keeps an eye on Twitter, regardless of what's going on. So I think he did see it himself when it came across. I did not. And I asked him, say, I can go with you. And he said, no, you just stay behind, finish the fight with the team, finish it off, stay and get it done. Roger, we'll talk later. It was probably a 45-second phone call. I then called the chief of staff and said, okay, we need to start putting in place an all hands message to the workforce and figure out what we need to do. In the middle of that call, Acting Secretary Wolf then called me. So I jumped off from our chief, This
is Chad Wolf. Yeah.
Acting Secretary Wolf, yes. And he said, well, I know you've probably heard the news about Chris. I said, I have. Is it me too? And he said, no, they're not asking for your resignation, but they don't want you running CISA. And that's, I'm paraphrasing his sentiment. And
but you were next in line.
There was a succession order that the secretary had signed and even updated it a few weeks ago when we added Brandon Wales as number 3. Now, to his credit, he hadn't been consulted on this, so he was kind of caught surprised by the White House's decision on this. And when I told him these would not be, conditions which I could stay, obviously, he said, "Don't do anything. Let me see. I see if I can fix this." And so for about 90 minutes, I stood there while my phones are exploding, and he was working with his White House personnel and others to see if he could get this turned around. And when he called me back, about 9 minutes later, he said he couldn't, and I regretfully told him I had to leave, and he understood that, and then that was that. So it was a pretty frenetic Tuesday evening, and it's still experience I've really cherished, being the deputy director of CISA and working with Chris, and really, as he's articulated, really proud of what we were able to accomplish.
Were you surprised by this level of politicization of an agency that's just there to give out practical and accurate information?
Kara, I was, there was a surreal nature to it, and seeing just Chris's firing all over the news when, we're a component of a department.
Right.
And when my resignation hit the press, I think Don Lemon broke into his broadcast and announced it, and then my name's on the Chiron. And in what bizarre world does the deputy director of a DHS component warrant prime time? So it was odd that an agency that was new and relatively unknown getting this kind of attention in a bizarre way. I think it helped our profile because we were trying to let the American people know all that we're doing. And our agency is really entirely based on partnerships. And so we do need people to know the resources that CISA has, the things that we can do to help, and the programs that we offer.
What about the people on the ground there, the people who are working within the agency? It was very dramatic what happened with Chris and you and Brian. But what happened? How do the people within the agency, which is how many people at this point?
About 2,200.
Right, working on all kinds of issues. How are they impacted?
Well, we've enjoyed some real stability for the most part during this administration, which I think was unique in the Trump administration, that you didn't have a lot of turnover. Jeanette Manford left us at the beginning of the year, but Brian stepped right in. And
they might not have known you were there, but okay, all right.
Yeah, that is true. The workforce, I don't think ever saw this coming. Now, to Chris's credit, I think he was playing in his head how this could unfold in a bad way, which is one of the reasons we wanted to bring Brandon Wales, and we created this executive director position. So there was kind of a quick removal of the political leadership, that it would stop pretty quickly. And Brandon is a tremendous career senior executive. And so that we just did that over the summer. So I think they were very, Brandon's presence stabilized things. My resignation wasn't effective until the end of that week. I actually had to unwind from some things. So I was in the office Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And a lot of people, everyone expected us to leave in January anyway. So in the big picture, it's only about 2 months. But the way it happened, I think, was certainly
well. One of the things you tweeted was it must stay nonpartisan, protect that. God gave us a conscience to use it. That was your messaging when you
left. That was my farewell message to the staff, to the workforce. I didn't want to use an internal email. And what I meant by that is, I think, Chris and I were of the same mind of this from the get-go, that our mission at CISA is somewhat unique within the department. One, we don't have any law enforcement authority.
Right.
And we're really the only agency that is completely reliant on a partnership model. I had one regulatory authority, which is over the chemical industry. So we regulate security standards for chemical manufacturers and suppliers. Everything else is a voluntary partnership model. So, if you go to the airport and you want to get on a plane, you got to work with TSA, whether you like it or not. You cross the border, you're going to encounter CBP, hurricane your state, you're going to deal with FEMA. No one has to work with CISA. But yet we have a mission to raise the baseline of security across 16 sectors of infrastructure, 50 states and the territories, in addition to the federal civilian executive branch, the .gov. And so we have to make sure that people want to work with us. And if we are starting to, play partisan politics with security, that, first principles of what a government should be doing, protecting those systems, those activities that enable our economy, that provide security, that drive the American way of life, that's what we're protecting at CISA. That is not a political issue. You can have legitimate political differences on a range of issues within the Homeland Security portfolio. Immigration is just one. But I have yet to see a partisan issue within securing America's infrastructure that warrants politicizing what we do. And what we're hearing from the Trump campaign was, in effect, politicizing the security of a subsector of infrastructure, namely the election system. And so that was my message to the workforce: is we've worked hard to establish that bipartisan, or really nonpartisan, reputation. We work closely with a number of governors, from Democrat states and Republican states, Governor Pritzker, Governor Ducey, Governor Lamont, Connecticut, DeWine, a whole bunch of folks governors who really cyber savvy, and if they think that we're playing games with, well, you're a red state, blue state, then we lose our credibility, and that's.
And yet here you are. It's only one of the things you do, which is election security, and here you are, and it has become politicized. So let's talk a little bit. Let me go backwards a little bit in terms of that. You didn't think, there's sort of that horror movie idea that the call is coming from inside the White House, actually. But I think one of the unexpected part of the election was that it actually went pretty smoothly. We didn't see major cyber attacks or attempts at foreign interference. They're obviously there all the time. Mr. Krebs at one point called it just another Tuesday on the internet. Why was it? Were we wrong about estimating the seriousness of the foreign threat, or did you, whether it's Russia or China or Iran, were there other things that they were doing, or that we were paying attention this time as opposed to 2016?
So, Kara, I think one of the lessons we learned for 2016 is, you've got the threat landscape, but you also have known vulnerabilities. And so what we really tried to focus on over the past 3 years is trying to shore up those vulnerabilities and working with the thousands of election jurisdictions in this country to offer them and partner with them to ensure that, one, as you've heard Chris say, install paper ballot backups.
Mm-hmm.
I think we had 80% of states in 2016, almost 95%. Of the vote was backed up by paper ballot, last month. And so it's that capacity building of trying to shore up where we know the vulnerabilities, whether it's in the voter registration databases, working with the election vendors with their infrastructure as well, and just working with the campaigns, making sure that their email protections and all the good cyber hygiene that they need to be employing, as well as the political parties. It was a full court press to do all of that. Now, in 2018, in the midterms, we didn't see a lot of activity. As the New York Times and others have reported, there were some proactive measures that this government took in those midterms. And I think that may have had an effect on the 2020 election day. But on election day, without getting into any classified, there were attempts, and we were very proud of the fact that a number of those all the states really batted them down, that they had those protections in place. And one of the things that we did over the last 2 years is to partner with these secretaries of state and election officials to have we call them Einstein monitors on their networks. So we have some intrusion detection visibility into what's trying to hit their networks. And so we were better prepared. I don't want to speculate on why the adversaries maybe didn't do as much.
Were these attempts foreign or domestic?
I won't get into that here. Let's just say there were the intrusion attempts and other types of mischief on election day again, proudly and this was an all team effort, right? So this is kind of the coordinator of all of this. And we certainly have an election team that was out working with folks. When you look at what the FBI did, NSA, all DOD, we had DOD personnel helping us, as well as a whole partners, the EAC, and really the states and localities themselves. So this wasn't
right. And the states have been the states governors, Governor Ducey, Governor Kemp, have all been very adamant that there wasn't election interference happening here or fraud or anything else. It's been an unusual statements by them, given how close they have been to the Trump administration, for example, in those two states at least. Just
as we try to do, they call it as they see it, right? So I think we spent all this time and effort, the American people did, with the funds that Congress gave us. Congress was extremely supportive of our election security mission, and I think that money was put to good use. So if the president had won, I suspect that Chris would have been, paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue. We'd be pointing to him, see, this was a legitimate election. See, this guy is telling it so. But it cuts both ways. And the president didn't win re-election. And so, but the security was what it was.
All right, so let's talk about one of the things that you pushed forward was the rumor control, and not just the foreign interference, but the uses of our own U.S. companies for domestic disinformation is much more complicated. So let's talk about rumor control and why you took it on. Obviously, it's not just incursions, security incursions, abuse of technologies and things like that, but it's actual just words and ways to influence people. Talk a little bit about that, and what role do you see these social media companies having in combating domestic disinformation? They've sort of done a stutter step towards some action, and I think low bar is a word I think of most of the time.
Well, let me go back to when I came into CISA, which was early 2018, and it was the 2016 election was still fresh in everyone's minds, and right then the the next target was protecting the 2018 midterms.
Mm-hmm.
And I really observed great partnership from the major platforms. We work closely with them, as did other government agencies. And I think they recognize that their systems were used for purposes that maybe they didn't always anticipate vis-a-vis an election. Ultimately, we at DHS don't want to be the arbiters of truth. So it wasn't really for us to say, well, this persona is some guy in St. Petersburg. It's for them to determine what's the violation of their term of service. And there's a whole debate now about Section 230, and that won't get into that because I don't think CISA really has a role in that. We didn't want to take the mantle of having to point out what's fake and what. I think that's a good role for government. But when it came to ground truth about the election infrastructure and how elections are conducted, we felt very confident we could make a statement there, and that was our role, to talk about the competence in the election and to swat down rumors related to that.
But here is the platforms being used to make people less confident. In fact, to traffic in lies almost continually and exhaustingly. There's about 10 up today by the president himself. So how do you, now that you're not in CISA, what is the role of the government in dealing with that? If someone who is the president of the United States is spewing lies on any of these platforms, what is there a role of government to do that, or you just let it happen?
So I am not one that is, small government Republican. So generally my sensibility is not for more regulation. I don't necessarily like the way that the platforms have applied some of the qualifiers to certain comments. I think it is tough. That's a challenge to try to attain consistency in that. Ultimately, what we try to do at CISA was to empower the public, to know your sources and to be a more enlightened citizen. I think citizenship should mean
media literacy is what you're talking about.
Exactly. We had a whole campaign last year about pineapple on pizza, which was to educate the American people about how foreign threat actors could take any issue and use it to divide Americans with lies and just sowing up discord. And we used a harmless analogy of some people like pineapple on pizza, some people don't, but we really showed the tradecraft and the tactics and the techniques that Russia would use to try to divide America. And I think the onus is on Americans if you're going to be a consumer of content and media, it's incumbent upon us to know what the sources are. And obviously in this day and age, what seems to be legitimate media often is not, and that's troubling.
All right, but in a lot of ways, I hear that from a lot of people. People should be responsible themselves. This is a quantum level of difference between a billboard or even a TV ad or a newspaper or anything else, because it's being flooded at you and very specifically targeted, and it's really difficult. And the way it's hidden, and it's confusing, and it's the mass amount of it. So, say you suddenly became the head of Facebook or Twitter, either one. What would you talked about those designations they put on, which are so confusing. This is disputed. Instead of just saying this is a lie, they don't seem to want to go that far. How far would you go in that regard? Because we are going to have to rely on these private companies owned by people who have no accountability to do something about this.
Yeah, Kara, it's a hard problem. I would still lean my personal views of not letting 100 flowers bloom necessarily, but letting speech prevail, letting enlightened people point out where there are falsehoods and disinformation. I think we need more people in the sensible center to do that, both in government and media and public life. But I'm just generally my inclination is not towards more suppression of speech, even if it's coming not from the government, because if it's not the government, it's not censorship, but even from the platforms themselves. I don't.
So what would you have them? You think what's there is adequate? This is disputed, which is, I don't know what that means. Actually, it's a non-sentence sentence.
Yeah, it doesn't really work for me. I have.
Here you are at CISA putting out, this is the truth, this is the information, which they could easily point to, and saying this is not true. Is that too far? Is that suppression to say this is a lie is not true? It's
a fine line. It's a tough line to figure out where you're going to draw it, right? So we felt comfortable and confident that we could speak with authority on what the facts are in terms of how elections work and what the election jurisdictions do, what the technology does. We never saw ourselves, and I know you're not asking this question, to be, moderating or arbitrating other people's speech online. But it is going to be a problem that is not going to go away, and as we become more and more beholden to online communications, it's going to be an even tougher challenge in the next election.
Yeah, these soft threats versus a hard threat. So can you assess the difference between these soft threats, which I think are much more significant, I do, than the hard threats? Talk about the difference and where we need to go in terms of what we need to focus on.
In many ways, stepping back for the election mission, we look really at the three lanes. There's protecting the election infrastructure, working with the voting companies that make the machines. There's working with the candidates and the parties and making sure that their emails are protected so we don't have another hack like the DNC had. And then there's the disinformation piece. It is, a hybrid threat where you have both, foreign actors who are looking to undermine Western democracies. But obviously, as you alluded to, there's voices from within this country that, as we see the continuing polarization, are going to use the same tactics and techniques to do the same thing, which is to sow discord. And I don't have a good answer for that.
And when you think about the threats to the hardened stuff, the machines, there's also been attacks on the Dominion machines. And just today, the head of Dominion wrote a piece about death threats and others. And obviously, Joe DeGenevo, and one of the most unconscionable things I've seen lately, although there's a long list of that, threatened to thought Chris should be executed. Steve Bannon was talking about beheadings and things like that. How do you deal with that when you're in that system? You want to be reasonable, and this is unreasonable, or beyond unreasonable. It's unconscionable is what it is.
Kara, it's egregious. A loss of words for just how absurd and offensive those comments are. I mean, I got to think that violates some type of code of professional conduct of the DC bar, and I hope they look. I know Chris responded on the Today Show. But, to quote George Costanza, we're trying to live in society here. And I don't know what happened to shame, right? I mean, for Mr. DeGeneva, why is his wife not ashamed of this kind of language?
No.
Ostensibly a one serious person on a national network should, he's a small man with a small mind and a bad mustache. And it's just unfortunate that, attacks on Chris or anyone. Have you felt under threat?
Has that been something? This is an area, as you said, was sort of a not well-known area. You started it 2 years ago in order just to put out basic information and work with all the different players. Have you felt under threat?
I have not. I'm also not in the same public view. The deputy's the one who's kind of running the agency day to day. Chris is the one out leading us, and so he's going to have a different experience. I won't speak for him, but obviously the comments last night are troubling. We certainly never expected CISA, its mission, its people to be under attack like this, and I hope it ends soon. I hope Mr. Geneva takes back those words, apologizes, and recognizes that maybe he just the hot lights of the studio got to him.
I doubt it. I'm sorry to say that. I think they double down on these things constantly and get worse, in fact. But when you created this 2 years ago, one of the things was to bring more tech people into government and to work on these things. So these things now tech intersects with everything. Can we talk a little bit about bringing tech into government in a more significant way? I know it's through the Obama administration, through the Bush administration, this has been talked about, but it still seems separate. Do you look at it that way, or do you feel as if the government has more experience and ability to understand that tech should be at the center part of this?
No, there's work to be done, Karen. Let me just qualify that, Chris and I took what the Congress and President Trump gave us and built CISA, but really the credit for creating CISA not only goes to people like Mike McCall from Texas, Claire McCaskill, Senator Ron Johnson, but also the Obama administration who tried to get this started. Suzanne Spalding and her team prior to CISA really started it. But the notion of we don't have enough tech people in government, and obviously we need to get more tech savvy in terms of getting to the cloud, right? So we look at mission protecting the .gov. We got to get away from 101 civilian executive departments and agencies having their own networks and their own servers and get to the cloud. Congress gave us some hiring authorities to bring in talented technology expert, workers at a lower level to pay them more, because right now the best coder out of Caltech, she's going to come in as like a GS9 because she doesn't have experience. In the new regime that will be in place next year, we'll be able to pay her more and get her into government quickly. But the other thing I'd say too is we need a tech infusion at the state and local level. When you look at really the problem sets of like ransomware, what I would hear from the U.S. Conference of Mayors and Governors is we really need more IT modernization for our cities and our states. When you look at some of the operating systems, they're still running Windows 7, and that capitalization for tech is not there. We talk about it, the next infrastructure bill, and I'm sure the roads and the bridges and the tunnels need work. But if that doesn't include a technology component for capital reinvestment in the networks and the IT systems of cities and states, then we're going to be missing opportunity. Because
why doesn't it happen from your perspective?
I think generally the CIOs and CISOs are not always at the, their constituencies are not as, they've not been around as long as like education, and we're not taking anything away from any of these other, important issues. But when you talk about, finite budgets and fiscal austerity, this is not going to be at the top of your list. But as you look at where the risk is now shifting, and that's one of the things that CISA we try to pride ourselves on, is really being a risk advisors to America. When you look at what ransomware has done to a number of large cities that affects the school system, affects the healthcare sector, it's not just you can't pay your parking tickets online. It's really taking down real major infrastructure that
is older
daily life. And so if you really look, if we reassess where our risk resides, I think then the case is pretty apparent that more investment needs to go into technology from government.
Yeah, Windows 7 makes me nervous. All right, we're going to get some questions from the audience. I'm going to read them. This is from Mary McGrail. I'm going to try to get to as many. We only have about 8 or 9 more minutes. Based on your experience at CISA, which industries or fields are most targeted and most susceptible to cyber intrusions? For example, we have now seen how vulnerable hospitals are. What about educational institutions? This, of course, matters during COVID and at all times, but especially right now. And let's try to keep these answers quick so I can get to as many as possible.
Sure. Real quick, you've seen a risk shift since the pandemic started, right? So you see the healthcare sector and hospital networks under more attack than we would previously. And before that, obviously the energy sector, financial sector, but those are better funded than some of the other sectors, so they're better protected. I think we're also depends on the threat actor, right? So if you're a ransomware criminal, you're going to go after kind of the weak links, places don't necessarily have modern IT systems or defenses, school systems and places like that. So I think, but if you're looking at nation state actors, they're going to be looking more for stealing intellectual property, privacy data, those kind of things.
Right. Okay. Question for Matt. Are you concerned that Donald Trump and his campaign associates will use the data gathered through Facebook and texting campaigns to continue to target Americans with disinformative information to their advantage?
I've seen no evidence that they are changing course.
Yeah, so, that's a big fat yes, I think. Correct?
Yeah, I see no reason to think they were going to stop.
Do you know how, and this is from Eric Geller, the last one, I'm sorry, was from, was an anonymous attendee, Eric Geller. Do you know how involved Trump personally was in your and Krebs' ouster? Was it all driven by some 20-something in the personnel office? I think they're talking about Mr. McAtee.
I believe that the president was aware of Chris, but I do not believe that the president was aware of me. What they did was they put a piece of paper in front of him that he signed that overruled the succession order. So I don't expect the president to be aware of it.
So you're an I don't know that guy person. Anyway, probably in truth. Are you in favor, this is from Jaspreet Sandhu, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Are you in favor of digital credentials for future elections? By when will national online voting be rolling out? Oh, goodness. That will go.
Online and voting are two words I never like to see together. So no, I'm not in favor of that. It's the integrity of the election system should be paper-based. It works. And there's talk about Bitcoin and other types of, not Bitcoin, but essentially, going to a kind of a, electronic protection.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's way off in the future.
Okay, but you think that is not anytime. The mail-in ballot already upset people more than enough, although unnecessarily. Patrick Gall, no question, just wanted to say that National Technology Security Coalition, a coalition of CISOs across the nation, is grateful to Chris, Matt, and Brian are at hard work, and they did to support the private sector CISOs. While CISA remains in competent hands, we are deeply disappointed with the level of disruption that has been created by the loss of these CISA leaders. Well, that's a very nice thing. Mary McGrail, based on your, this is, she already asked this one. What is next for Matt Travis and Chris Krebs? I think you'll just have to answer for yourself. Will they remain involved in some fashion with CISA? Will you go back in the Biden administration, or what's going to happen also to the agency under Biden? I
was a political appointee, so I'm a private citizen now. I'm kind of assessing what's next for me, taking a little bit of a break. And I think for CISA and the Biden administration, I hope they continue to put it on a growth trajectory. Let me just say that the Congress has been very supportive of CISA, and I think it needs to be a $3 billion agency at a minimum. It's about, right now, President's budget is 1.7, and you look at our expanding mission set. So I hope the Biden administration continues to help CISA grow to reach full operational capability.
Okay, as an anonymous attendee, do you think it's possible for a government agency to combat disinformation that comes from elected officials within the United States, or is it politically sensitive task best left to civil society and social media platforms? If yes, how do we as government respond to foreign amplification of domestically originated disinformation without stepping into the muck? That is what happened. There was a lot of domestic information that then got amplified by foreign players.
Yeah, that just has Orwellian overtones for my liking. I just really don't like it when the government is the arbiter of truth when it comes to just basic speech.
Okay. Calvin Westbrook, we just have 2 or 3 more. Silence in the face of inaccurate, disputed information, which is what Twitter calls it, can be construed as implicitly supporting such information. How should confusion be addressed?
I think I would go back to what I'd said before. I think it's not just one person on these platforms. The rest of us are on there too, and we can counter argue and point out where things are false. I just think it's up to our society to do a better job of policing ourselves.
All right, just 2 more. Nick Schifrin, I'm sorry I can't get to everyone. Even if you can't provide details of Election Day interference, can you describe how significant the attempts were?
No.
Okay, that's easy. Big, small, little. And last one, Maurice Turner. Actually, I'm gonna. I'll do this very quickly. Can state and local election officials keep up with security requirements without consistent federal funding?
No, I think so. I think it needs to be a priority. I know that there has been federal funding from Congress through the Election Assistance Commission and all the services that CISA provides, from vulnerability assessments that we do all free. So I think that model's worked. And listen, it's a national critical function that we're able to conduct elections. So if we're not putting our money there, then the whole thing, there's bigger trouble we're going to have.
Okay, last question. I'm going to read one, but you don't have to answer this. This is from Mombasa, Kenya, from Mahmoud Noor. The trust and confidence in the U.S. election system is very important to the rest of the world. The disinformation will really embolden dictators in Africa and across the world. This is absolutely true. But the last question from an anonymous attendee: who is the biggest threat to the U.S.? That's my final question here.
From a cybersecurity perspective, it's still the big 4: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. They all have their different kind of focus areas on what they do and why they do it. But it's those 4 from a cybersecurity perspective, and no one else is even close. No one is even close. And domestically? Cyber criminals are both, in terms of the ransomware that comes abroad, and we don't really assess domestic threats from a cyber perspective. It's all ones and zeros. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, Matt, thank you so much. And thank you so much for your service. It's really important that we have these voices of truth. Just accuracy, not just truth. Let's not even use that loaded a word anymore, but accurate information is really valuable to the continued robustness of our democracy. Kara, anyway. Thank you so much. All right, thank you very much. And thank you, Aspen and Susan. Thank you for all the questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them.